My name's Dan Smith. I'm director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. I'm very happy to welcome you here this afternoon for this seminar to discuss this recent report, and also to welcome an online audience who are also with us. As you know, we're talking about this new report, 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. This is a report, the two of the three authors are here, Richard Gyasi sitting next to me and Fei Su sitting opposite me. And I'll also take the opportunity now to introduce Björn Jedin of the Foreign Policy Research Institute here in Stockholm, third member of our panel. As is usual, we're going to do this discussion as a discussion and a conversation, rather than a series of set-piece talks. And I'm going to invite the audience to come in with such questions and comments as you have during the course of the meeting. I think you're all aware of the extraordinary importance of what is now called the Belt and Road Initiative, or the New Silk Road. It was one time called One Belt, One Road. It's a huge investment program, Chinese program, more than a program. It's an economic and development strategy, emphasizes connectivity in trade, in supply chains, in communication, in cooperation. There's a huge amount of infrastructure investment involved in it, on land and with harbors for the maritime part of it. So this is an enormous enterprise, and one of amongst the many issues which it raises for China, for the region, for participants in the investment programs and so on, and for the world as a whole, are the security implications. SIPRI has been addressing these, and Richard and they have been part of addressing this for several years now. And in February last year, we produced a report on the security implications of the land-based dimensions. So now this is the partner piece on the sea. The report was funded by, and I want to thank them very much for this, funded by the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung and developed with the foundation as well at the same time. It's published by SIPRI, but it has very much this cooperative element in it. And perhaps, actually, I will go off script, Richard, if you don't mind, and just ask you quickly to describe the working methods by which you developed this, because this is not a piece of work where you sat at a desk in Stockholm and thought to yourself, what do I think about the world? This was an inclusive, participatory piece of research. So perhaps you can tell us about that, and then I'll turn to Sue and then back to, Fei, and then back to you for discussion of the contents, and then thirdly to Björn for some commentary. But the approach to the research, the methodology, how did you do it?
Sure, thanks, Dan. Well, indeed, it's been a combination of desk, but definitely also of field research, as was also the case with the BELT, or Silk Road Economic Belt report that Dan referred to. What we normally do is set up regional workshops. In this case, we covered the South China Sea, and as a result of that, a workshop in Manila in the Philippines with a lot of regional stakeholders and a number of extra regional stakeholders, academic community, policy community, media community, to an extent business, civil society. We repeated that for the Indian Ocean region, and we held a regional workshop. These are two-day regional workshops in Yangon in Myanmar. At the sidelines of both these workshops, we also obviously spoke with regionally, locally based experts and analysts. And then we continued with a third workshop. This one was held in Shanghai. Same format, same approach. As a result of that, we spoke with multiple institutions and an even greater number of analysts.
So you're getting a lot of input as you go from people indeed in China, people in the regions, South China Sea region, the Indian Ocean region. So let's kind of go back to basics, if you don't mind. Okay. This is a huge investment program. What are China's aspirations with it? What kind of range of possibilities do they cover in their thinking and in their ambition about this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for your question. So, first, I wanna be clear is that the Belt and Road Initiative is a still unfolding initiative, and because it does not have a clear institutional framework, so when we look at this project, we try to search for like how will this road fit into China's core interest. And inside that, and we found like one of the key driving factor is actually China tried to develop its blue economy. And so through this road, China tried to export its overcapacity and also searching for new and emerging markets in the countries, such as in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And for this, China tried to enhance its domestic economy security by diversifying its global market dependence. And this expanded overseas interests, of course, will need also China's stronger maritime power and to protect its overseas interest. And it also lead to an expansion of this maritime space. And we have seen like the road was initially a ASEAN focused, and then is have a broader coverage, and to especially these two strategic maritime space, South China Sea and the Indian Ocean region, and we try to cover it in this report as well. So just before you go on, let me clarify a couple of things. You mentioned the term the blue economy. Yes. Blue economy is... so like broadly in China, the blue economy is regarded as ocean-related industry. But for like European perspective, is more there's more about only maritime economy, but it's also about sustainable development as well, and the ecological system. And so this started by focusing on the ASEAN region, Southeast Asian nations, and then has moved on from there to embrace to South China Sea, Indian Ocean region, and South Pacific, the Mediterranean Sea, and last year we also see China has published this new white paper and incorporated the Arctic Ocean. I was going to ask, is there a patch of water which is not included? I guess.
Very little left.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is. In this sense, it is a global strategy.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not regional. It's not specific to this area or that. It's broad, but as you said, it has no specific institutional home. There isn't a department of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, I think even inside this doctrines within Chinese government published, even though like they try to give a specific guideline of that, I think it's still like evolving, and we have seen like there's expansion of that. So, and when we talk with a Chinese expert, and they're saying like we did not set up the boundary of that, and let's just put this out and see how it evolves.
Right.
Yeah.
And just one last thing before I move on to Richard. You've very much, as I hear what you've said, you've very much explained this as being essentially about the Chinese economy. There is overcapacity in it. There's a need to be stabilizing in it. There's available investment resources to be using. And that's the driving force of this.
That's part of the economic objectives of that. And of course, there are also strategic objectives.
So go into those a little.
Yeah, okay, sure. So apart from the economic objectives, there like China also try to secure its supply chains, and this especially true to China's food and energy security. And there's a increasing demand in China for food imports, and China just become the largest crude oil importer last year. And for secure these supply chains, we have seen this expansion, this maritime space expansion is also because for working for this, serving for this goal. And also there's a increasing demand inside China to foster a stronger navy power to secure their overseas interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose it's logical in the end. I mean, trade is two-way. So if there's one part of this which is outgoing and to export, and then the supply chains and the imports which they need to make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually logical with China growth, and it need to ensure its supplies. And this for this part, I think it's understandable what they're doing.
So as you did the research, as you talked to interlocutors in the South China Sea region and in the Indian Ocean region, what kinds of perceptions of strategic, perhaps economic, but especially security impact did you identify? What do they tell you?
Sure, they tend to vary. If we commence with the South China Sea, if you take the ASEAN member states, obviously there's different levels of economic development, say Laos, Cambodia, one end, and Singapore on the other end. Still, you could say that these member states have an interest in developing the regional blue economy, in greater connectivity within the region, but also the region and with other regions, including with China, and generally having good ties with China. So that is definitely there. However, some of them, and increasingly we see, the Philippines, Malaysia comes to mind, for instance, there is a certain wariness of economic overdependence and how that over time could potentially translate into political leverage on the Chinese side. So they're trying to balance, a number of them are trying to balance economic opportunities with sovereignty. If you look at the region, generally speaking, ASEAN, like the EU in fact, has certain integration and cohesion challenges. We see the US showing lackluster attitude in terms of commitment, in terms of continuing to be the security actor it is in that region, and certain anxiety about, well, what is going to happen if China's footprint does indeed grow in this region? What is China's vision for this region? How will it affect her own security or economic opportunities, but also aspects such as cooperation on maritime affairs?
You mentioned the Philippines. Before we move on to the Indian Ocean, I want to explore this a little bit more in the South China Sea. You mentioned the Philippines, and the Philippines, of course, took a case to the International War Court of Justice about claims in the South China Sea, which found against China, which China then dismissed. But my impression was that since Duterte became elected president of the Philippines, that in fact the Philippines government had taken a much more, let's try to use a neutral word, cooperative relationship towards China, was less inclined to be pushing the case, was less inclined to be actually in that sense asserting its claims, which had been based on concepts of sovereignty. So has that changed, or is there more nuance in the picture?
There's more nuance indeed. I mean, on the one hand, indeed, there's been a certain, let's say, alignment with Beijing, but in practice we noticed, also as we dealt and spoke to some of the local interlocutors, they haven't quite formed a strategy towards the road. So they're still developing thinking on this. So what we see is, and it kind of like reflects some of the other actors in that region, where the road kind of like oscillates between two ends. One is the economic opportunity and, like, let's say, a shelving of these maritime disputes, the jurisdictional disputes that Southeast Asian claimant states, among them the Philippines, has with China. That situation is already quite in a deadlock, and yes, the tensions are there, but there's no direct, real military threat, one could argue, with economic opportunities and cooperation. But it's been a little slow on the Manila end, indeed.
So moving on then to the Indian Ocean region, I mean, what kind of concerns come out there? I mean, there must, first of all, there's India. There's Indian relations with the other states within that region. And then there's issues, I mean, this is a huge trading area, and, you know, on the edges of the Indian Ocean in particular, either edge, there are huge piracy questions as well. So pick your way through regional perceptions of those issues a bit for us.
Sure. Well, the Indian Ocean region indeed is a much more vast maritime space. 34 states, 32 I believe are littoral states. Stakeholders, obviously that pool is larger, but it's not just the regional ones. Of course, among them India, the one you mentioned, Dan, but also extra-regional stakeholders, including the EU, the US, Australia comes to mind, Japan comes to mind. And like with the South China Sea, a great deal of world's trade transits through that region. Now, the role of the road is, you could argue, it's twofold. Let's start with some of the, let's say, negatives or potential negatives. So on the one hand, you have in terms of the Indian Ocean region being a security space, you have a theater of actors, and comes in a new actor, China. It's a rather ambitious actor, and it moves quite fast. But a number of the stakeholders, mostly the US, India, Japan, Australia to an extent, are growing somewhat more anxious about what China's growing economic, and as a result of that security footprint, what that might translate into. So the security implications. The US is now, India has an active role as well, but the US is the primary security provider in that region. So as China, and as we now project into the future, as China grows its footprint, how will it affect the security arrangements? Will it lead to, let's say, some kind of arrangement between the US, India, China? What role will there be for EU member states? Will the transition into that be rather peaceful, stable? How will it affect sea lines of communication, global trade? So these are some of the potential negatives, and one could add to that as well. I'm going to have to make it a little bit more complex, but it is a complex region. The way China, through not only the belt, but also the terrestrial component, the belt, is interconnecting the Indian Ocean region. The Indian Ocean region itself is well connected with the EU, with the US, with, for instance, Japan, all the major economies. But the region itself, and also especially if you take into consideration the Eurasian hinterland, Central Asia, Western China, is not well connected at all. South Asia is not well connected. Central Asia is not. East Africa. So in that sense, as China tries to connect all these regions, the economic, and as a result of that, security interests of all these players at this complex equation. And that is where, you know, one may worry, because obviously there's certain tensions, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt, the bloc of Egypt, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Qatar perhaps on the other side. So what we'll see most likely is a greater interaction between all these different complex security spaces within the region.
Right.
So that is one, and then you have China's entry, and that raises a lot of question marks. Obviously, all of these actors have an interest in securing commercial transit. But still, in practice, all security changes at such a level will have implications, and there'll be hiccups. Then to move to kind of like the more positive ones, obviously all this interconnectivity is, if indeed China and other stakeholders succeed, it's gonna result in the opening up of the Indian Ocean region, where you see perhaps Central Asia having greater access, where you see interconnectivity in the regions and among these regions in this region improve. Obviously, that comes with a lot of economic opportunities for the local states, but also for the EU and, for instance, for Sweden.
I was going to say earlier on, you said, you know, it raises questions, and you listed some questions, and then you said, so this is where the worries come in. But if they're questions and just question marks, then as you went on to say, there's a positive side to it as well. I mean, is it fair to say that these questions are at the moment unanswered, that we don't know which way it will go? We don't really know whether this is going to lead to a new era of open trade, greater connectivity and stability, or whether the proximity will lead to greater tensions and rivalries, or a mixture of both, indeed.
Right. We would argue a mixture of both.
Yeah.
And since the Belt and Road is an unfolding initiative, and it's a long-term initiative, it merits further observation and study of how it unfolds indeed. But it's going to be a combination of both. Now, obviously, we also need to say, I guess, a lot of these tensions in Asia, maritime disputes, territorial disputes, lack of political trust, strategic trust, lack of institutionalization, they were there before the road was introduced. So they're not necessarily all the making or the product of the road, but obviously the road rekindles them.
So Björn Jedin, if I turn to you now, Europe, it's got to mention as we've gone along. It's obviously the destination for a portion of the trade. There's a big stake there for the EU. What do you feel is the state of debate within the EU about the Belt and Road Initiative? What degrees of understanding are there? Where are the gaps? Where does there need to be more focus, or is it adequate?
Right, thanks, Dan. And I also want to congratulate SIPRI, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, and my co-panelist for providing this excellent report. Well, I think the first point is that the state of debate about the Belt and Road Initiative in Europe has the same problems as a state of debate about the Belt and Road Initiative in other parts of the world. And that is, we don't really know what kind of creature this is. And why don't we know? Well, I don't think the Chinese know either what the Belt and Road is. It's an evolving process, as has been mentioned earlier. And exactly how it will impact economic structures, regional cooperation, and also security competition, it's yet unclear. Having said that, I think we are seeing in Europe sort of two parallel tracks in the approach toward the Belt and Road Initiative. One is an increased interest from actors in Europe, on the EU level, on the national government level, and also among the private sector and some parts of civil society and academia. On the other hand, we also see somewhat increased suspicion about this initiative. And we have seen several signs of that. For example, a leaked report from the EU ambassadors in Beijing, which is also cited in this SIPRI report, expressing some misgivings about how the Belt and Road might impact EU interests. And I think we are also seeing it within the European Parliament. There are a new resolution in preparation there, which will contain, as I understand it, somewhat harder language when it comes to China. So I think the worry here from European perspective is that will Belt and Road develop within an international order that Europe has a great stake in, or will some part of this initiative emerge into some kind of competitor order to the current one that was initiated by the US and Europe? So I still think, from a Chinese perspective, there's some way to go to convince Europe that this really is the very positive development that it is portrayed as in China.
So, what does that fear look like, or what does the object of fear look like? The, disruption of the world order has happened several times since the current world order was established, and the tweaks happen, changes happen, it evolves. It is the world order, stemming from the Bretton Woods Agreement and the Bretton Woods institutions and the establishment of NATO and then the Marshall Aid, which essentially created Western Europe. That world order did not stand still. There was a thing called the Cold War, which came to an end. There was great change happened after that in the last 25 years. It's still evolving. It's no more a done deal. It's no more locked in place than the Belt and Road Initiative is locked in place. So it's not kind of knocking down one statue and putting up another. So what is the shape of the fear that you sense or identify in the EU? And Richard, maybe I'll ask you and indeed Faye to chime in on this once Björn has given us some thoughts.
Okay, so I have a go first. Well, I think these kind of thoughts that you express now are also shared within Europe, and I think this is also the reason that we haven't seen a clear dismissal of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think here is a substantial difference between the attitude in Europe and the attitude in some countries around the world that are among the best of Europe's friends, such as the United States, such as India, and such as Japan. I think there is still a greater optimism in Europe about our ability to co-shape this initiative in a direction that doesn't go against our interests. But I agree with the authors of this report that in this still pretty early stage of the initiative, I think it's a critical space. And I think it's important also for the Chinese here to really show that there are opportunities also to take part in this project as equal partners and to shape its direction. I think if Europe feels that we have the capacity to do that, I think some of these worries might abate. However, if we are seeing developments within this initiative that suggest that there aren't really that many opportunities for us to shape it, and we have better to sort of present alternative visions and to try to counteract this initiative, I think it will be much more tensions than within Europe's involvement in the BRI.
I think that's the thing which is worth coming back to. Let's try to park it and remember it for the moment, which is whether there is an alternative vision that could be successfully developed and driven forward. But first, Richard, your sense, do you essentially agree with what Björn was saying? You'd like to add or nuance that about the shape of the fears and concerns that Europe has?
Right. I do. I wanted to add to that as well is partially that fear also stems from fear over what this, let's call it cross-pollination, as China engages in all these different markets, countries and regions. This cross-pollination of, let's say, governance models, standards, of business standards, of an emphasis on human security rather than perhaps, for instance, state security, regime security. There is a fear that if this pollination is quite effective, that is to say, if China does indeed directly or less directly start to shape such countries, these participating states, these are not necessarily in line with the norms, the political governance norms, values of the EU also applies to the EU's kind of take on development, generally having quite a strong human security focus, and some of its business standards. In addition to that, I mean, any transition from something that is secure and known and has been around for roughly a few decades, at least in the Indian Ocean region, to something, to let's call it the unknown, obviously that sparks a bit of anxiety and fear. What will these new arrangements look like? What are China's actual security ambitions? And some of that fear, I think, also has to do with a lack of in-depth knowledge of, well, what are China's core security interests? What are ours? And we need to sit together. These are global commons, and we need to sit together and talk where we conflict and where we overlap.
Faye, as a Chinese observer of Europeans observing China, what do you see in the European fears, such as they are? What do you see that you can understand and empathize with to some degree, and what do you think is just kind of off the wall?
Sure. So I think, like, for most of European countries, the investment from China is still attractive to them. But there's a concern about whether there will be like political implications behind it. And I think, as Richard and Björn has mentioned, there need a great clarification about what is this initiative about. And because of China only, emphasis on the positive part of it and the economic motivation behind it. So I think we need like the Chinese government to be more clarified what could be the possible political or security considerations behind it.
Has any of you seen the Chinese academic or think tank world express analyses which look at the potential dark side or the downsides of BRI for participating countries? I mean, is there an awareness of this, or is it just all being projected in the most positive light?
I think I have been read about some of the Chinese experts have mentioned about this strategic overreach. So since China, at the beginning of this initiative, there's not a lot of guidelines from the government. And so there's like pour out this investment to a lot of countries. There's not a complete risk assessment. But after 5 years now, I think a lot of Chinese experts has been realized this problem, and they're having discussions, and they have conducted several risk assessments about that.
Right.
And I also think if we go back a little bit further, even before the BRI was launched, there has been debates in China about overreaching. So I think this is a very, this is a concept which is known to the Chinese expert and policy community very much. However, at the same time, we're seeing this very positive spin from the top leadership about this project. So, of course, these directives will form how the debate about the BRI takes place in China. And apart from some, maybe not critical, but some voices that are, expressing some doubts or concerns, on the whole, as far as I understand it, it depicts this initiative as something that is extremely positive, not only for China, but also for other participating countries. And of course, in this general mood, it might be easy to overlook some potential pitfalls in this project.
I'm going to open it up to the audience in a moment, so if we can make sure that the microphone is available and people are ready. But first of all, Richard, I wanted to come back to the Indian Ocean region, and in particular to India. I mean, India is a long-standing, well-confirmed rival and competitor for power and influence with China. It has a border dispute with China, and it has a border dispute with a Chinese ally in Pakistan. There was military confrontation last year in the in the China-India border dispute. So, what are we hearing from India about this? Is it panic stations? Is it firm opposition? Is it sit down and talk about this and do business? Because what's coming out of India so far as you have seen and heard and been able to appreciate from the interlocutors you've had?
Right. There's definitely a panic, and there's definitely a lot of criticism. Unfortunately, there's not much dialogue so far. Talking to the Chinese side, they say, well, we've definitely welcomed India to engage and to discuss this. And when we talk to the Indians, they say, well, we've never received an invitation. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. Either way, India is very concerned. That is to say, it has quite publicly, even at some of the higher levels and the highest levels, criticized the initiative. It agrees that development is good, and that connectivity is good, and that there should be closer cooperation. And indeed itself, India, has also become a little bit more active in this realm, partially cooperation with, for instance, Japan. But it feels that the initiative is not quite multilateralized yet, and that it's not inclusive enough. You go to the Chinese side, they'll say, well, look, they'll mention many projects where you have Kazakhstan and China and a number of European countries working together in the same project. So, well, how about this? The problem is obviously is that the initiative, as Faye mentioned, isn't quite institutionalized yet. It's a little too flexible, a little too fluid, actually. And what is certain, though, is that India will need to sit together, not only with China, but with other stakeholders. That initiative is going to be there, if not for decades, and definitely for many, many years to come. And you see most of India's neighboring states actually participating in either the belt or the road, sometimes both. So that appetite is definitely there. And India just can't compete financially, or in terms of basically, if you take the whole package, diplomatic, financial, strategic. So India is best off sitting with China and like-minded stakeholders.
And presumably best off, as is also the case with the EU, and most likely to be part of this, to help make it successful, if it feels it has a real stake, going back to the point, in shaping the initiative or in co-creating it, even though it's well along the way. There is so much that's open that if there was the possibility to be really taking part, that would help ease fears. Right? I mean, that seems to me to be a clear message coming out from each of you, in a way. Yeah?
Indeed.
There's another question which I'm going to raise in a bit, but in the meantime, questions from the audience on where we've got to so far. When a forest of hands doesn't go up, there's two things which I can do. One is I can just turn around and ask you the question, because this is the privilege of being the moderator. I get to ask questions. It's so much fun. If you ask questions, okay, you can sound intelligent while knowing nothing. I think at least I know that the second half of that I fulfill. First half, that's for you to judge. Or I can just say, well, I can make the oldest joke in the world. Right? Well, if we couldn't have the first question, can we have the second one? And then we go back to the first one. So please, somebody put up a hand with a question and save me from coming up. You're answering all the questions before they've even been asked, panelists. Okay, then what I want to ask you about, making use of my privileged position, is this question of whether there is an alternative, right? Is the strategic choice whether you're thinking of a country on the scale of India, of the European Union as a conglomeration of countries on an enormous scale, or you're thinking Myanmar, Vietnam, Kazakhstan, individual countries. Is there an alternative to going along with this, right? And trying to shape it as best one can? Is there an alternative vision? And if so, what would it be and how could it be driven? I forget which one of you it was who first mentioned the concept of an alternative vision, but one of you needs to take responsibility for it and say what it could be. Björn, was it you?
Okay, I'll do my best. Well, I think the alternative vision from European perspective, at least, is not the new vision, it's the old vision. It's basically the international order that developed since the Second World War, characterized by multilateral cooperation, if not free, so at least pretty free trade, and also concern for certain political values, including human rights. So I don't really see Europe teaming up with others to propose sort of an answer to the Belt and Road Initiative. What's interesting with the Belt and Road Initiative is it's not really a clear alternative to the current world order. It's not a response to anything. It's an invention. It's an invention, and China in that way has the initiative, and all other parts of the world, including Europe, will have to respond to this. And it's difficult to respond to the initiative in a critical way without dismissing it altogether. And I think Europe's dilemma in a way is that we are not interested in contributing to any kind of new great power blocks. That's why I think there's also some concern about this Quad concept in the Indian Ocean region, which you mention here. But you could see that, at least in the security sphere, that such a clear alternative would develop, formed around a certain numbers of actors that explicitly wishes to counteract China's vision. We're not there yet. I'm not at all sure if there's even a possibility that we might end up there. But I think from European perspective, that such a development would also be a big worry.
Richard?
Well, I think we would say that there isn't actually any initiative that approximates the BRI, and at least not on that scale, geographic scope, and financial and diplomatic commitment. Obviously, there are ongoing cooperation and connectivity endeavors. Japan, for instance, I think I mentioned it before, has also become much more active. Somewhat more cooperation with India, for instance. Australia is looking at it. But none of these are really at the scale, the scope, and the long-term commitments of China. So that's not going to change. I agree with Björn, even if there were to be a certain teaming up of this Quad, which is the US, Japan, Australia, India. It's not really a, let's say, an institutionalized framework. It's not fully functional, but it has resurged a little lately, partially as a response to China's ambitions. US, definitely little appetite in any such like greater overseas investment endeavors. So that's not really going to happen. And if you are going to intend to somewhat co-shape something as large and long-term as the BRI, doing it from without is not going to make any impact. And opposing it, actually, you could argue, doesn't make much sense either, because it does, that is, the BRI initiative does intend to fill this vast global connectivity gap. And in addition, it's become this cornerstone of Chinese foreign policy. So if you want to change anything, it would make more sense to try and do it from within. And that normally you'd have to do with like-minded stakeholders. And there's a few out there for sure.
Hey, you got some thoughts on this?
It is a little add-on from for Richard and Björn's perspective. So maybe the European countries can find a way, engage with the recipient countries, so to ensure that to some extent, like China's project will deliver to a acceptable level, and so I don't think like there's a lot of countries can provide investments and this scale can compete with China. But maybe some tailored approach from the European countries with because I think European countries have a really strong role or power to, politically and economically as a broker with in the region.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can't propose an alternative to it because nobody has the scale. All right? You can't really oppose it, or at least not effectively. Could you ignore it? Could you just say we don't engage with the question of whether this is an integrated initiative at all? We look at what possibilities there may be for investment in Rotterdam, or look, the Chinese want to put up some of the capital for that. We look at what the possibilities may be for railroad investment, linking up through Central Asia, or that's also very interesting for different specific reasons. But whether this is part of one initiative or not is of no further interest to us. Would that be a viable way?
Well, I think in a sense you could ignore it and keep on what you've been doing before.
If there's anything in this suggestion at all, it's not that you ignore the activities.
Yeah.
It's that you ignore the overarching rationale of the initiative, the language of the initiative itself.
Yeah, and I think that's what some countries have been doing in a way.
Right.
Maybe not ignoring it. I don't know if I would call it that, but Sweden, for example, has not been signing an MOU with China, and a lot of countries haven't. And doing that means, in a way, accepting the language of the initiative and accepting sort of its vision for international relations. So I think there's a choice there to be made. Not ignoring it, but not accepting it wholesale.
Right. But nonetheless, cooperating where it makes sense in the specific activities which it's generating.
Well, I think if we again take Europe, Europe has been active in this region for a long time. And we had something called globalization for the last couple of decades. And it's based on connectivity within regions and between regions. And of course, China is not the first actor sort of proposing the importance of connectivity. Of course, China is doing it in its own particular way, and it has the scale to really implement something that maybe hasn't been there before. So yes, I think it's possible to sort of ignore the conceptual framework of it, but the problem there is also that China is a very powerful country. And this is a very important project to China. So no matter if you're a small country or a big and important country, when you have dealings with China, there's going to be a lot of pressure to engage in different ways within this project. And that might be difficult in the long run if the Chinese keep at it.
And also the implications of that cannot be ignored, or, so even though the EU has not have a collective common stance on the BRI, but at the same time, China has, through the 16+1 platform, has got to actively engaged with countries in Central Europe and Eastern European countries. And that we can see, even though the EU as a whole maybe try to not recognize the initiative, but still
several
yes.
EU, and that's the 16+1 platform.
Yeah.
16 EU countries.
It's some EU countries, but it's also some non-EU members.
Yeah.
Right. In a relationship with China
Yeah.
over the Belt and Road Initiative.
And other issues as well, but
Right.
of course it has a very important role within this framework.
Yeah.
Part of the connectivity that we talk about in the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road is to do with political cooperation. And in fact, am I right in thinking that it goes also into the cultural sphere, at least if you regard tourism as cultural? That's also a part of it. So how do we handle those dimensions?
Well, the initiative definitely also applies to culture exchange, of which indeed you could take the tourism box there. It's definitely promoted by China and appealing to participate, to a lot of the participating states. The thing is that I mean, you mentioned the political dimension, and I think that's where it's especially appealing. If we look at our findings, a lot of the developing economies are very interested in the initiative, especially at the state, at the administrative level. There's indeed prospect of, and indeed it quite often materializes, of increased investments, power plants, dams, you name it, increased employment. But that kind of like positive sentiment isn't always felt necessarily at other levels of society. I guess the challenges, and it boils back a little to what we've discussed here before, is China in a sense sells the narrative perhaps as too positive. Team up, you can expect this will materialize, and you're happy, we happy, everybody happy. And in a number of cases and on a number of levels that may indeed happen, but what we need to remember as well is that, as it applies to any investment, including relatively simple things such as the exchange of tourists, China's not necessarily in control of domestic policies.
Sure.
Right? It can build and it can invest, but ultimately, what are you going to do with those power plants? These power plants need, prudent economic policies to make sure that, private sector, for instance, is engaged, is stimulated, that certain investment rights are guaranteed and protected. So that's, I guess, the part where it gets tricky, because Beijing could obviously do that domestically, but it can't do this overseas. It can just stimulate it.
And I think it's worth remembering that we're just 10 years on from the Lehman Brothers crash and everything that came after that. And in one way, the Belt and Road Initiative was a kind of idea that couldn't have been had in the OECD economies in the wake of the great crash. But China was very important in stabilizing the world economy in 2008, 9, 10. Could it do it again if there was another crash? I'm not asking you to answer the question. It might well outreach any of our knowledge, but it is one of the big questions to think about at the moment. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative could then be horribly vulnerable to that kind of development. There is actually somebody else who wants to ask a question, and I'm very relieved. You bring the microphone down the front. Maybe with this, Nan, you'll unlock the doors and others will come flooding through behind you.
Thank you for the very interesting report and the discussion. So I'm wondering, as the road gets further deeper into Indian Ocean, what are the security implications for Africa? And what I mean by this is, against the backdrop of the recent China-Africa Security Defense Forum and the increase in China becoming an arms producer, have we seen a link or evidence of a link between the BRI, this Defense Security Forum, and China potentially moving into Africa as a major arms exporter, and tagged onto that, linking its arms exports to foreign policy within Africa?
Yeah. Well, in terms of China becoming a major arms exporter to Africa, I think I'm one of the least qualified experts at SIPRI to answer that. In terms of just security implications for Africa, yes. I mean, on the one hand, we see China investing quite heavily also in ports, in upgrading them in East Africa. We see them basically setting up a naval base, which is Obok in Djibouti. And at least East Africa's, including the Horn, their security interests and reality will become more or increasingly more part of that of the Indian Ocean region. Now, you could say, as China's footprint grows in East Africa, it may have a certain leverage over their, let's say, security priorities, alignments. This could indeed happen. But otherwise, I mean, East Africa is, in terms of connectivity, both intra-region and with the ocean, it is very limited. China comes in, invests, opens new connectivity doors. So in terms of, let's say, the to give it a more positive spin in terms of some of the economic security implications, those might end up being of quite different nature.
Mm. I mean, China has been investing in different ways enormously in Africa. A lot of development assistance with much fewer strings attached than many African states feel come in European ODA. It's present there in a trading way and so on. That has been quite a dramatic change. So this could be the additional dimension that was consistent with that. Björn, you?
Yeah, and well, this is a really big and important issue, and this I think is one of the most important possible implications or ramifications of this entire project. Whether it, in the long run, will lead China to establish permanent military presence in other parts of the world. And this is the expectation of many. And many point that this project sort of follow the great power playbook. You start by trading with countries, they become more dependent on you. You want to protect your assets and control domestic developments in different countries and balance against other actors. And that means that you will move your armed forces also through bases, as the United States has done. And we're not there yet. I don't think it necessarily will happen either in Africa or in other parts along the road. I think also that the Chinese leadership is very much aware of possible negative impact on taking such a direction. It will mean that it's possible to portray China as sort of an imperialist state, even if this happens, through equal partnerships rather than colonialism or anything along those lines. But it will sort of open up China for the risk of much more intense security competition with the United States and other actors. So I count among those still, not convinced that China will take that road. But if you go to India, for example, many people there are utterly convinced that this is going to happen and that we basically already are along that way, and it's no turning back as long as this initiative is still in place.
Yeah, I just add on from your points. I think, let's say for maybe, and if China gonna set up another military base, and I think the rationale behind that still has to be like humanitarian operation related, and it cannot be for military or the pure military purpose. And also back to Nan's question, this is a bit like out of the range of our report, but I think that China has this investment in Africa for decades already. And this is now started by anything related to BRI. And it could be, Africa countries, this investment could be some like kind of test bed even for the BRI.
I mean, one of the things about big strategic initiatives or big strategies is that they usually are a bit less new than they seem or are touted to be. So they usually include an element or a number of elements which are familiar and have been there already, maybe indeed for decades. And successful strategies tend to be ones which go with the grain rather than against. Now, there are exceptions to that, which in economic jargon is when you get disruption with the kind of the major, essentially destruction of a market or a sector and its replacement by something new. But I don't see the Belt and Road Initiative as being a disruptive factor in that sense. It might be disruption in world politics in the long run, but that I think is still an open question. Otherwise, I think that it moves in with the grain of much that has been happening in those regions, much has been happening in the world, and much that China has been doing and profiting from, and also sometimes in domestic terms paying a price for. but there seems to me to be a lot of consistency there. Would you share that kind of general reading, that it's a packing together of many relatively familiar things along with some new elements?
I think like this is kind of like one of the point we have researched on also about the possible interdiction of the sea lines of security. But what we found is like this is more like China try to diversify its supply chains, its sea line routes. And this is more like their kind of concerns whether there will be, the U.S. or other like major powers would interdict their supply chains, and for that, and that's why China is trying to, broaden and expand its maritime space.
Björn?
Well, I do think that it sort of following trends, broader structural trends that have been there for a long time, and there's obviously a demand in big parts of the world for this project. That's very clear, and it also is accepting and sort of deepening trends about economic globalization, and it's also following along the lines of the UN Charter about state sovereignty, right? And we don't know what kind of superpower China will be, but the BRI is our best clue. So I think this tells us that China will be interested in economic globalization, and China will be interested in protecting state sovereignty. If we look at the indications from the BRI so far, it tells us that China might not always be interested in upholding international law. If we take the Philippines case, for example, and China is not interested in promoting individual human rights. So it's sort of taking some bits of the sort of Western-led international order, and it's not openly criticizing the other parts, but it's sort of ignoring them. And it seems to me that this could be a vision for Chinese
and
leadership.
After all, the Western leadership of the international order has also, from time to time, not really wanted to be bound by international law, and hasn't always been ultra consistent in its treatment of human rights.
Well, I think if you look for consistency, international relations is not the best place to look.
Yeah.
Of course, there will be hypocrisy, and we've seen it before, and we will see it with China too, definitely.
Yeah. One last chance for questions, if there are, from the floor. Yes, down here.
In the report, you talk about how the maritime disputes are shelved. How long do they get shelved for with the sort of economic gains?
Right, nice, short, to the point question. I guess in a sense that's the million-dollar question. The thing is, and that's one of the reasons why we called it a shelving, the situation is a bit of a deadlock. None of the actors really, regional, extra-regional, wants direct military confrontation. But there are great tensions. There was, for instance, just a couple of days ago, UK, Navy, China response. So those tensions are real, they're there, and the tensions are not necessarily decreasing. The shelving has more a bit to do with, well, we can't really seem to come to any agreement on how to take this forward now. That is to say, China has rather bold, ambitious maritime claims in the South China Sea, but so do a number of the South Asian states. They've tried to work on this for decades, many years. And at this stage, at least, not much has come out of it. There's been certain codes of conduct, certain preliminary agreements and codes of conduct that haven't really materialized either. So what changes now is basically everything remains the same, except China says, well, if we can't really come to a solution, at least we can cooperate on this. And to some of them, that is some of the ASEAN member states, that's quite appealing, that's quite attractive, especially the ones that are cash-trapped or landlocked, like Laos. On the other hand, certain analysts would say, well, look, in that scenario where China gains a greater economic footprint, and that translates into a greater political security footprint, could over time, when the moment is more favorable, could that kind of like be used as a leverage in terms of these disputes? And that is, I think, obviously it's a projection far into the future, but that's a lingering fear. Until that time, there seems to be a shelving of these disputes, yeah.
Okay. One last question from the front. It's Nan again.
I have a question regarding debt with BRI, and given the recent reports about how China has been operating in defaulting of debts in African countries, has there been an increase in debt risk within countries related to the BRI?
Well, yes and no. I mean, obviously, quite a few of these debts were there before the BRI. And China actually now says, well, look, you're trying to, let's say, shift the blame all on us, but quite a number of these countries have long lingering debt issues. On the other hand, as China invests in these, cash-strapped countries with relatively small economies, obviously including those in quite a few in Africa, such major critical infrastructure investments are normally run into the 10, the 20, the 15% of local GDP. So it definitely adds to that. And that kind of like has become one of the main critical reflections on the initiative. We've heard it coming out of DC, we've heard it coming out of the EU and other stakeholders, as in, well, China, look, we don't necessarily object to you investing here. And yes, we agree, infrastructure is important, but perhaps you should consider doing it a little bit more proportionally, or change the terms, or find a different approach. Because indeed, one of the cases actually, and that has become the single most kind of like mainstream critical point on, or at least the road component, is Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. So actually Sri Lanka couldn't pay back some of its debts. Then actually checked with India apparently. I said, well, look, we can't pay back these debts. Can you help us out? Are you interested in the port? They said, well, we can't really help you out, at least now financially. And what happened is it translated into a 99-year lease for China. Now for China, that you could argue is quite favorable, but that single case, for instance, is now being used and extrapolated. And it's something obviously that China needs to think about a little bit more prudently.
We also seen in the last few weeks only where a change in leadership in both Malaysia and Pakistan has led to some very open concerns about the kind of financing structures involved in BRI projects in those countries. So I think we're already seeing some pushback on that part.
Okay, well, I'm going to then... Oh, no, sorry, please. Delay.
Yes, thank you. So I'm from Chinese embassy. So I think this gentleman is very interested in the debt issue, especially regarding the Horn of Africa. And unfortunately, I just come from Ethiopia. I was working there for more than 2 years, and I think I know a little bit about the debt issue, especially in Ethiopia. So I think let's look at the debt issues. I think many people here, especially some, from the media of the America, they are very interested in these kind of issues. First, I'd like to say, for these African countries, we all know that infrastructures are very important, even for their long-run development. But for them, for these kind of poor countries, and they can't lend money from any other institutions. And before, they can just just get the money from the World Bank or the IMF, or get some ODA, but that's not enough. For China, we are willing to pay the money. We are rich. But nowadays, they can't pay their debt. One problem is not because of themselves. One major problem is the world economy. let's take Ethiopia for example. When we sign some kind of lending agreements, they think the Ethiopia economy can grow as strong as they used to be, over 10% annually. But after the financial crisis, the whole world is, the economy is not in its good shape, so they can't export. And due to these reasons, the debt sustainability become an issue. And then they come to China. And we are trying to solve the problem with them together. And you all know, I'm not an expert, but I know that for infrastructures, especially for the railways, the roads, it needs maybe more than 30 years. And even for that long period, maybe they can't make any profits. But the key problem is that when we invest in the Addis Ababa to Djibouti railway, so it's a big, huge project. We invested in a huge money in that. Maybe we can't make any profits from this railway. But after we build this railway, the whole world is very interested in investing in Ethiopia. Sure. Because even some Ethiopian friends told me that this railway is a lifeline, because make Ethiopia the landlocked country become a land-linked country. And maybe when all the people focus on the debt issues of Ethiopia, only the stakeholders know that the Ethiopia has a bright future. And without this railroad, they can't maybe draw attention of the other investors.
Okay, thanks very much indeed for that contribution. Can you take the mic? So, is there any other last question from the audience? Then in that case, I'm going to pitch the last question, which is a sort of classic, well, okay, what to do now? Right. The two of you have included recommendations in this really very good report on the basis of the analysis you've done. You can maybe go into a couple of those points, and Björn, I'll give you the opportunity to start. What do you think the EU should do now in relation to this overall approach?
Well, I'm very curious about EU's new connectivity strategy, EU-Asia connectivity strategy, which will be released just in a week or so. So I think we will get some kind of baseline there, what the EU intends to do. I agree with many of the suggestions in the report. I think it's good to try to engage China. I think it's important to be very clear when engaging China about what kind of values that the EU would like to characterize joint initiatives. I think it's also very good to directly engage countries in this region, as the EU has done before. I'm sure there's a lot more to do there. When it comes to EU's security role in these regions, the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, I think that it might be quite difficult for EU to really fulfill the kind of ambition it has. And the ambition as stated in the EU global strategy from 2 years back is that the EU should scale up its security role in Asia. These are crowded neighborhoods. And I think in the past there's been a lack both on the supply side and on the demand side. I'm not sure that the current situation is much more welcoming for greater European engagement, although I do think that there's a lot the EU can do in sort of more narrow sectoral cooperation, but the EU really engaging in this region as a very big, important security actor, I think we would need to see quite substantial changes both from the EU and in this region for that to happen.
And also, I think when we have the interviews and the workshops in the region, we can see that the Southeast Asian countries and the South Asian countries, they're very welcome EU's engagement, especially for ASEAN. They look at the EU as a learning model, and to that expect, I think then EU can provide some training of that. And another thought is just Since China have this new kind of initiative, this new formats, why not EU learn from China as well?
And Richard, last word.
Right. So, as stated, the road definitely serves a number of China's core interests. However, that doesn't mean that there could be positive spin-offs in terms of cooperation, in terms of development. This is an unfolding narrative. So this component is to be seen. What is quite certain is that because the road is there to stay, the EU especially should pay closer interest to its own foreign security and economic security interests in these two important maritime spaces. Its interests are vast in terms of its own hard security power projection capacity. That is limited, obviously. That is a reality. But as Faye has said in our workshops, they do welcome a role for the EU. That role is, let's say, twofold. One is sort of a mediator, a mediating role in, well, getting stakeholders together. That obviously would include China, the US, and India, ASEAN, and obviously quite a number of other stakeholders. And it's frankly time to sit down. I mean, the interests of the EU, especially in the Indian Ocean region, cannot be overstated. And 19th of September, indeed, there'll be a new document on the EU's kind of like connectivity ambitions and aspirations for the terrestrial component of the Belt and Road. But also in conversations quite recently in Brussels, they admitted, they said, well, look, actually about the maritime component, we haven't given it much thought. And we have, to an extent, looked at and prioritized the South China Sea, but not really the Indian Ocean region. And having said that, if you look at indeed the EU's global strategy, but also its maritime security strategy, there is overlap indeed with the road. So those potential cooperation avenues are out there. And we've suggested a few in the report, but we said for some of them, they will require a bit more dialogue, a bit more political trust, security understanding, and a bit of creativity.
Okay, so take it seriously, reflect on it, read the report, and sit down and talk about it. It's a good, clear message. Thank you very much to three excellent panelists for a wonderful discussion. Please join me in thanking them and thanking you all for coming as well. So, thank you very much.